Hello, friends. My name is David Blakesley, and this is episode 2 of season 5, 1973, of Criterion Reflections. This is a series of clips that I'm making that will be covering films affiliated with the Criterion Collection that were originally released in the year 1973. Part of a long-term project I've been working on since 2009, where I'm covering the entire Criterion Collection in chronological order. Taken my sweet time at it, as it turns out. It's taken me a couple weeks to get this next clip together, in which I'm going to be talking about Luchino Visconti's Ludwig, or Ludwig, if you want to be faithful to the original German pronunciation. And the reason, it's taken me so long to kind of get my thoughts together on this is that there's a lot of movie to take in. You can see here, this is the Arrow video box set, a 4.5-hour epic that was pretty brutally trimmed down for commercial distribution on its original release. At some point or another, a TV presentation of the film was made available that shows all of the 4.5 hours of film that was made to tell this story about Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, during the 1860s to the late 1880s. And it's quite a sensational story, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But yeah, for the second consecutive episode, I'm covering a film by a renowned and highly esteemed Italian director that is kind of late in their career, that takes a full 4.5 hours to tell the story. Roberto Rossellini was the subject of episode 1 in his made-for-TV recreation of Renaissance Florence, Italy, in the Age of the Medici. And the second episode here, again, a film that's available in both a 5-installment miniseries format or as a more cinematic cut, basically 4 hours plus, a little bit edited out here and there. Maybe some of that time was taken up with end credits and, starting and stopping each TV episode added a little bit more time to the overall run. But in any case, a big story about a very notorious and fascinating historic individual, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this film, but first of all, since this is an Arrow Academy release, you can see the logo right there, what does this have to do with the Criterion Collection? Because I am pretty closely focused on Criterion affiliated films, and the reason I am including it here is that it's been featured on the Criterion channel, I think at least a couple times, most recently in a bundle dedicated to the performances of actress Romy Schneider. Extraordinarily beautiful woman, very stylish and impeccable in her portrayals of different characters over the years, the course of her career. And in this film, she plays a very important supporting role as the Empress Elizabeth, the object, his infatuation. She's a kind of unattainable catch, if you will, that he loves, that he feels very comfortable with. And yet, because of her position in life and because of her own interests and desires, she does not make herself available to him. They happen to be cousins, which is, of course, for many people, a pretty significant obstacle. But he does end up proposing at one point to her younger sister, so the close proximity of the bloodline was not a canceling reason, in his mind at least, as was the case of nobility of that era. But I digress a little bit. So Luchino Visconti, of course, has a very generous representation in the Criterion Collection. Let me just tell you a little bit about some of his works and my own personal Visconti collection. So the earliest Criterion film of Visconti is Senso from 1954, which really has a pretty close connection to Ludwig in terms of the approximate historic era of its setting, the very operatic flavor of the film, and really a preview of things to come in Visconti's later career. White Nights, or Le Notte Bianche, a beautiful film that really could use a Blu-ray upgrade, if not the full 4K. Early performance of Marcello Mastroianni, and a really exquisitely romantic kind of soul, heart-crushing film. Uh, really beautifully staged and performed. Maria Schell also had a very important part in that. Visconti's probably most famous film, or at least the most renowned established classic in the art house contingent, The Leopard, starring Burt Lancaster. Another great historic epic of a very pivotal period of Italian history. A more recent release, The Damned, which kind of begins a trilogy of sorts of this late stage of Visconti's career, looking at kind of the decadence of the early Nazi era, and then kind of following that up, Death in Venice, again, released several years ago by the Criterion Collection, part two of that trilogy, and then Ludwig kind of rounds out the trilogy, kind of the death of the aristocracy and the kind of the end of the era in three successive stages. And then there's this film here, Conversation Piece, which again is a very powerful work, again reuniting Burt Lancaster and Luchino Visconti as they're both kind of nearing the very end of their illustrious and legendary careers. So that's my personal Visconti collection. I'm really waiting for Rocco and his brothers to get a good release, a domestic release by the Criterion Collection. It is available for streaming on the Criterion channel. Ludwig, unfortunately, is not. It was a limited run release and may not be coming back anytime soon, since they released it, or they published it on the Criterion channel in a limited edition run back in towards the end of 2022. So maybe it'll come back, and if it does, and if you don't want to buy the disc, then I really recommend that you go for it, watching it on streaming whenever it's available. This particular edition, this is a double jewel case set. You see both parts 1 and 2. I'll kind of remove the little band here, and so you can kind of get a look at the original artwork. This is from a poster from its original release. If you want to see some of the special features, I'll kind of hold that there for a second if you want to get into it and kind of look closely at what's all involved here. But what you get in this original Arrow edition, which is now out of print from the lately lamented Arrow Academy line, are two presentations, one on Blu-ray, one on DVD, of the same content for each disc. This is part 1, again another original release poster. I think this was the French edition. The cover that I showed you for the box is, I think, the Italian version. And this is an American edition of the poster, recreated for this Blu-ray and DVD digipack, or not digipack, but dual format edition. And you can see here on the back covers the run times of the various versions of the film, if you will. But again, let's look at that text on the front cover here. I'll let you read it for yourself there. But it is definitely kind of showcasing Visconti's sort of interest, if you will, in, at the time, what passed for sort of lurid, exotic, maybe slightly forbidden fruit types of subject matter, homosexuality in particular, but also Visconti's personal history, his background. He was a bona fide titled aristocrat, old European money from a family that had apparently had a very strong control over the city of Milan for a couple of centuries at least. So Visconti was one of these guys born into, highest tier wealth and privilege, who decided that he was not going to stay bound within that system. He would stake his claim to, make a purpose and a substantial statement with his life by wedding his resources, his talents, his energy, and his interests to a cultivation of the arts, the art of cinema in particular, but also opera and theater. I think he had his hands in all of those worlds. And this is an example of kind of Visconti's impact and importance back around the time that Ludwig was released, here's a couple books I own that are basically screenplays. Back before you could rent a VHS tape or certainly a DVD or digital presentation of a film, screenplays were probably the closest version of being able to take the movie home with you and re-experience it by maybe reading along the script and playing the images out in your mind. And so you see these films were not only screenplay, but you can see little snippets of the photography that was shown. So this one here, La Terra Trema and Senso, two very early films of Visconti. And here's a few other later ones, White Nights or La Notte Bianche, Rocco and His Brothers, and The Job, which I don't know anything about. So maybe revealing a little bit of my ignorance or my still work in progress of studying and understanding what Visconti was all about. And then back to the Ludwig release here, you also have a very nicely bound book, which has a few essays, some illustrations, artwork, and all of that. So what is Ludwig about? Okay, so Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, was, like Visconti, a man born into nobility and privilege, except he was actually a cut above Visconti. But Visconti was like a count or a baron or something like that. But Ludwig II was an actual king. He was the ruler of this domain known as Bavaria prior to the eventual merger of Bavaria and Prussia and perhaps other smaller principalities into the nation we now know as Germany. And Ludwig II, before this movie was made, was known as a builder of castles, the Neuschwanstein, the fairy tale castle that is so prominently featured in a lot of tourism, and others. And you know, I wish I knew more, like, internalized about all of this history. But he built these immaculate, incredibly detailed, and almost dreamlike architectural masterpieces in Germany, and he also financed the composer Richard Wagner, who was a great master of opera, of symphonic music, and really did a pretty incredible job of just capturing some of the essential German mythos and legends in musical and theatrical form. So Ludwig was highly dedicated to this pursuit of the arts and the aesthetics, even to the neglect of his duties as a sovereign monarch. In fact, he was quite uninterested in the affairs of state. He ascended to the throne at the age of, I think, 19. His father died suddenly and somewhat unexpectedly, and so you can say, in a sense, the kingship was thrust upon him, and so he accepted that responsibility to a certain extent, that he had access to a great fortune and wealth, but it did not turn his interest towards statecraft. And in fact, Bavaria got involved in the war that he really did not support and actually opposed, but because of the diplomatic connections and obligations of the time, he was powerless to stop, even though he supposedly had supreme rule over the country. And that war did not go well. It ended fairly quickly, without tragic or devastating loss of life, but it certainly was an omen of worse things to come. As Ludwig aged over the next couple decades, he just became more and more isolated, and more kind of withdrawn from the affairs of the world so that he could pursue his own interests. He was not a man drawn to other women, other than the Princess Elizabeth I talked about, the Romy Schneider character. But that may have been more of an unfulfilled yearning that he had for a soulmate, somebody who maybe understood him and appreciated him, but could not give herself over to become his wife despite his very earnest pleas. There's a lot of character development that happens over the course of these 4+ hours, and it's all quite fascinating and way more detailed than I can go into here. But the performances are pretty impressive. Helmut Berger is the lead character, Ludwig, and you see him age from a teenager to a man, in his, I guess, late 40s is when he passed away. And he shows the wear and tear of not only the weight of the crown, so to speak, but also his own personal struggles. He was a man who I think you can say is profoundly misunderstood by his contemporaries. He had a vision of what life and culture and civilization could be that in many ways the world was not ready to accept. And that was kind of the central struggle and tragedy of his life. So I'm going to save some of my more extended analysis of the film for a podcast that I'll be recording very soon with my friend Brad McDermott, who's a big fan of Visconti. Brad and I have talked about other, great Italian filmmakers, Pasolini in particular. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. Brad himself is a visual artist, and I think we're going to have a really fun and hopefully enlightening and lively conversation about the many splendors that this movie has to offer. For one, the set pieces, the environments that Visconti has access to, the absolutely mind-boggling opulence of the interiors. These are not sets; these are real mansions with real art on the walls and all the details fully inhabited of a lifestyle and access to privileges and aesthetic refinements that I cannot even imagine living in. It's enough just to behold it on the screen. But this was Visconti's world in many ways, a milieu that he was very familiar with, and could kind of give us a guided tour from the inside, so to speak. So it is quite a piece of work. It's a film that's been subject to a lot of criticism. It is long. The original screenings of this film were severely edited, perhaps to the point of incoherence, because so much of the extended dialogues that I think really are the heart of the film were cut in order to keep the narrative moving ahead. But without those extended kind of pieces for reflection and consideration, you just have almost a pageant of royals going through their agonies, and that can get kind of tiresome if you're not really deeply immersed, familiar with, or interested in the subject matter. In fact, you may indeed despise the aristocracy. I kind of count myself among that camp, but it is a phenomenon that really happened, and the individuals who found themselves through the accident of birth in this highly privileged and influential station in life, the decisions that a person like Ludwig II made as he was confronted with the options of how to exercise that privilege and power makes for a pretty fascinating study in character and in history and in the social and political and kind of cultural pressures that come to bear on a very sensitive and perceptive soul who didn't necessarily embrace everything that was thrust upon him by the standards of responsibility, but he made something pretty extraordinary occur, both through the music and the architecture that he sponsored, and those are monuments that stand and feed and inform us to this very day. So yeah, that's a few of my thoughts about Ludwig, and again, DVDs, the Blu-rays, the box set. Tune into the podcast. I'll have updates posted when that's available. Thanks for checking out this video, and I'll come back to you really soon with some new stuff in Season 5 of Criterion Reflections, 1973.